Um, Welcome to today's neuropsychiatry meeting. It's going to be the first of 2 consecutive weeks. Normally we're fortnightly, but due to some excellent planning on our part, we've managed to go weekly for the next week. So hopefully see you here again next Tuesday. But we're very excited today to have a talk that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. We've got Ben Alderson-Day, who's here to talk about his research and his, presumably some of the content which is in his amazing book Presence: The Strange Science and True Stories of the Unseen Other. So Ben is an associate professor in psychology and a fellow of the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham University. He's a specialist in atypical cognition in mental health. His work spans cognitive neuroscience, psychiatry, philosophy, and child development. And I think I first became aware of Ben with some of the work he was doing with Hearing the Voice previous to this, and have been a fan of his for some time. This is a book that I bought a few months ago, and it was my bedtime reading, and it actually was too scary for me to read in bed, because there are these sort of quite chilling moments, some of which I'm sure we might come up against, but it is really fascinating. And I'm very, very keen to hear this talk. Usual housekeeping notes for today. We are recording the meeting, so if people aren't happy with that, please leave now. Please mute all your microphones and switch off your cameras. Occasionally their camera switches on, and it's a bit difficult for us to sort of let people know without interrupting the talk, but we will write something in the chat if that does happen. Don't take control of the slides, as this can disrupt the conversation. And you can ask a question by writing it in the conversation or by raising your hand. And we should have ample time for a Q&A afterwards. And if you have raised your hand, I'll ask you to share your camera, to put your camera on, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask the question directly to the camera. And if anyone needs captions for the hearing impaired, select the 3 dots on the toolbar and then press turn on live captions. So I think that's it for housekeeping. So yeah, very pleased to introduce Associate Professor Ben Alderson-Day, who's going to be talking today about presence. Ben.
Many thanks, Tom. And I should say thank you so much for this invitation. It's really, really kind, and a real privilege to be presenting to this group, both for the people in person in the room and people online. I'm just going to try and get my slides going. Please tell me, can you see the main screen there? Because Teams has done that thing where basically it hides everyone else. So I just have to take it on good faith that you're all still there and haven't gone to lunch. Tom, can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, I can see it clearly. It looks a little bit like there's still a window within a window, but it's occupying most of the space. So I think that's absolutely fine.
There's the presence of a window.
Is that better?
Yes, now you are occupying the whole space with your slide.
Lovely. Okay. Right. Well, let's get going then. So thank you everyone for coming along. As I said, what I'm going to do today is try and give you a sense of this book, my book Presence, that came out in April this year, and also the story behind the book and how I came to write it. When Tom invited me to do this talk, I was like, okay, so it's IOP. You want the science, right? You want the science rather than the book itself. It's like, no, we want the book. So what I've tried to do is also give you an idea of some of the actual research underpinning this book, but also most of it is backloaded towards the end, and instead at the start of it, at least, we've got more of the kind of the stories around how it came about. Because I'll be honest, I never really set out to write a book. It's not something I aim to do. As an academic, I've been working in psychosis research for over 10 years now, so kind of from my first postdoc, and I, do the usual thing. You kind of churn through papers or whatever like that, and I always marveled, but it was also kind of slightly baffled at people who had the time or the idea to write a book. But genuinely, this book came from something that puzzled me, and the need to have a space to explore it in a different way, perhaps a different way in which we usually work. what I'm going to do today is give you a sense of, why this topic, why presence, and why do this work via a book. Then I'm going to talk through some of the ways in which I approach this topic, and how I set out to kind of fill the gaps, really, of my understanding, at least initially, of how we understand this phenomenon. And like I said, in the final part, I'm going to try and give you a glimpse of what I've ambitiously titled the new science of felt presence, but which to some degree is also the old science of felt presence. There are things that we've known for a while now about how this phenomenon works, but there's also new things coming every day now as well, which means it's quite an exciting time to be thinking about it. So why presence then, and indeed, what do we mean by presence? This isn't something that intuitively people always kind of come across or feel like they've got a firm grasp of. They might have a sense of it, they might even have experienced it themselves. But even in terms of psychiatry and phenomenology, it's definitely kind of on the edges of what we'd usually study. Interest in presence goes back to people like William James writing in the early 20th century, and indeed people like Kraepelin and Bloiler. It's something that has been recognised as something that we need to try and understand. James referred to it as a perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the more special and particular senses. While much more recently, Gilles Fanelon, who works in neurology, works primarily on Parkinson's, described it as the vivid sensation that somebody distinct from oneself is present nearby when no one is actually there in the absence of sensory clues revealing a presence. So this is a really crucial distinction here. So it's that sense of somebody else separate from you, but in the absence of kind of sensory evidence, or at least clear sensory evidence. Sometimes the whether there is a sensation there is a bit murkier. Now, presence is a term that gets used in lots of different ways. There's a whole journal called Presence, which is about the sense of presence in virtual reality, the sense that you are there. Within phenomenological psychopathology, for example, people like Louis Sass write about the sense of presence, that you feel like you exist in the world in some way. This isn't that. Felt presence, as I'm kind of talking about it here, is about the sensation of the other. And really, that's what the stories in this book are all looking towards. But beyond these kind of more definitional approaches, often I come back to the very pithy descriptions that we used when I first heard about felt presence in relation to psychosis. For example, a young man called Daniel, who is a voice hearer, who in particular heard one kind of fairly dominant voice that would talk to him almost every hour of the day. And we spoke to him as part of one of our research meetings at Durham about this experience really in depth. And after a while, he just almost exasperatedly said, sometimes you don't even have to hear him. Sometimes you just know he's there. I can distinctly remember that moment because it shifted something for me about how we were trying to understand the experience of hearing voices and the experience of hallucinations. It felt like we were somehow missing the point and there was something else going on kind of behind the scenes in some way. Now that first meeting, that observation from Daniel came as part of Hearing the Voice, the project that I was on at Durham for 10 years that Tom's already mentioned. Just briefly, for those who haven't heard of Hearing the Voice before, it was funded by the Wellcome Trust for 10 years. And the aim was to just understand more about the first person experience of hearing voices or auditory verbal hallucinations. This is an experience that, while primarily has been studied from a kind of medical or psychiatric lens for the past 50 to 60 years, over different ages and across different cultures and societies, is an experience also that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And that means that it's particularly conducive to exploring in an interdisciplinary way. And that's what we did at Durham as part of Hearing the Voice. So you can see some of the specialisms up on the screen here, the people who were working on this. I was coming more from a cognitive neuroscience and kind of psychology background, but we also have philosophers, literary scholars, linguists, anthropologists, religious scholars too, all working together to try and understand more about the understanding of this phenomenon. And people often ask, so what did you find out? What were the key things that Hearing the Voice did? And it was a big umbrella. We went off in lots of different directions, but a theme that we kept coming back to in our work was the idea that how people experience voices, and indeed how they use the term voice when they say I hear a voice or I've got a voice with me all the time, is they're often talking about kind of social agents, characters in their kind of almost internal psychic environment who can visit them and sometimes even come in different forms where it's not just about sound. So this notion of presence, this idea that voices could have presence in some way or could be there without speaking, that the voice just happened to be something that this entity or character did, kind of grew quite organically through the years of hearing the voice. And some of our empirical work tried to explore that in more depth. For example, in 2021, we published in Schizophrenia Bulletin the first year's results of our 3-year longitudinal study of the phenomenology of voices in early psychosis. Now, early psychosis should always come as a bit of a kind of with scare quotes behind it, because capturing the very early stages of psychosis, as many of you will know, is incredibly hard to do empirically. Often there are many foothills before you reach the kind of really the valleys and the mountains of kind of unreality. But what we did in this study is we were trying to explore, for people who are using early intervention in psychosis services for the first time, who had been experiencing distressing voices relatively recently to the point that they would need professional care, we wanted to know what are those voices like and how they develop over time. And in particular, we're interested in these social or characterful elements, because they're quite key to thinking about voices further down the track, which might be suitable for things like avatar therapy. You know, therapies that rely on dialoguing with a voice. If you're dialoguing with something like a hallucination, then you need something that's going to have quite specific and complex social and personified qualities. But the reason I bring up this study is that as part of the longitudinal work we did, from a number of different respondents, as part of a kind of wide-ranging phenomenological interview, we had people spontaneously talking about presence again. So, for example, Emma, as a pseudonym of a participant, referred to, you know, that feeling you get when, like, there's another person there, a staticky feeling that could happen without even like anyone, you know, whispering or anything. So again, that sense of something that doesn't have to speak to be felt. Another respondent, Will, talked more about the kind of bodily senses that he would experience when he described presence, the instant shiver of the sensation, or that feeling through your body when you know that somebody, as he said, walked over your grave. And what we found was 52% of our sample of these early intervention and psychosis voice hearers described these sensations of presence alongside hallucinations and other modalities too. And yet, there's a sense that it's just not something that's directly looked at within psychosis research in particular. And one reason for that is there's a kind of problem at the core of how we understand something like presence. If we go by, for example, Fenelon's definition, if these presences are somehow lacking sensory content, then it's very hard to think of them as kind of hallucinatory, because hallucinations are about sensation, they're about perception. Admittedly, though, you know, we'd usually define them as that sense of something without an external stimulus, but with a compelling sense of reality. But you still need a core of sensations. So what people are feeling when they say they feel this is very hard to pin down. And often people also kind of flip between talking about a knowing and a feeling. When we get into the sense of knowing that someone's there, then that sounds a bit more like a belief. Now, within psychosis, unusual, strange, hard to interpret beliefs are kind of part of the core thing that we're often looking for and trying to understand. It's not uncommon that people feel under threat, feel like they're being watched, feel like they're viewed negatively by others, all of which could inculcate a kind of a strong kind of core belief that other people are out there at all times in some way. And I think one reason that this topic maybe hasn't been addressed directly so much in research as compared to other phenomena is that people then essentially just file it under paranoia. They say, well, this is, you know, this is just an expression of a strongly held delusional belief. Or they say, well, actually, it's really a secondary consequence. You know, you believe, you hear voices enough, you start expecting that they're going to be there. You start believing unusual things about the world. It's a natural reaction to an unusual perception, essentially the kind of appraisal model of how we interpret unusual perceptions. Quite a prominent British clin psych who came to visit our team at one point a few years ago. I remember trying to describe these ideas of kind of personification of voices, but also feelings of presence even without voices speaking. And this person said, "Oh, well, you know, people believe lots of unusual things about the voices," and it said, you know, kind of case closed. That was it.
Ben, you've muted yourself. Oh, I think you're back.
I'm back here. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, the last thing we heard was sort of people believe lots of strange things, case closed.
Okay, I'll need to restart sharing, I think. Or unless, can you see the problem on the screen?
Yes, yeah, we saw
Okay,
that.
lovely. So let's just. So I don't think I'm trying to think what I said after that point of muting, but I don't think it was anything absolutely crucial, other than to say that for us, this description kept coming up and up again and again, and the way people were talking about it, it didn't sound like paranoia. And if anything, it sounded like something that they usually wouldn't talk about. They actually found very, very hard to put into words. Whereas if they were feeling suspicious or they feel like they were being watched, they could tell us that. But there was something about this sense of presence was something that went beyond their normal language. And the other thing about presence that, as I kind of began to explore it and try and understand a bit more about it, was that this is something which happens in many other contexts and conditions, in much like other kinds of unusual experiences, or indeed things like hearing voices. So working from an interdisciplinary perspective, we want to think, well, what can we learn from those other contexts and other conditions? Now, if anybody's interested in that kind of problem at the heart of presence, I've written about it a bit more in a standalone essay for Eon that came out in May this year, called A Thickness in the Air, where I talk about this idea of being a kind of paradox at the heart of presence. So that's why I was interested in exploring this topic. And I guess for some people, it'd be like, right, let's go and write a grant. Let's go and kind of plan a series of experiments which are going to tease apart this thing. But for me, I felt like I wasn't even sure that we were there yet, particularly when you're dealing with something that might be very hard for people to describe, that might be very hard to explore empirically. It seemed to be something that you kind of needed to get more of a sense of in the round. And I had started writing about presence a little bit in 2015 and 2016, including a piece for the Psychologist magazine that the BPS produce. And on the back of that, some people have got in touch with me and asked me, you know, is this something you'd be interested in turning into a book? And I was like, at the time, I was like, no, I don't do that sort of thing. But as the years went on and kind of these questions of presence kind of came up and up, I realized I wanted to, it was like an itch that needed to be scratched. I wanted to explore it more. And thought, well, what are the ways in which you could tackle that sort of problem kind of differently from doing kind of straight up research? The actual kind of direct trigger, though, for me thinking now's the time to try and do a book, was I was standing in a garden in Edinburgh in July 2020, in the kind of the gap between the two lockdowns that was happening in that year. And it was in the garden of some friends of mine, Hazel and Luke. Hazel was a friend from university at Edinburgh, and her husband Luke, who I knew a little bit, but not that much. I knew to be somebody who went on big kind of expeditions and things like that, and he's very, very adventurous. And he asked, "Oh, I used to work on these hallucinations things." And I was like, "Oh yeah, do bits and pieces." And kind of still, you know, was my specialism. And he said, "Yeah, I've had those. You know, like Shackleton in Antarctica. Yeah, I had all of those." And he never. I didn't know that these things had happened to him. As it transpired, he hadn't actually talked to anybody about these experiences. And I realized that I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to know more about what kind of things he's experienced, because the reason on the Psychologist magazine that we've got here, the reason that it's covered in snow and the reason it'd be interesting to talk to Luke is that presences in particular are really associated with solo and survival situations, really associated with things like polar expeditions, people trying to traverse Antarctica. And most famously, Ernest Shackleton, the British explorer who tried to reach the South Pole in 1914, and the Endurance expedition, as it was at the time, never managed to reach that point, but ended up with some of the most famous experiences of felt presence, known as the third man. So talking to Luke was an opportunity to maybe try and explore that in a different way. So I got back to the people who originally said, would you be interested in maybe trying to turn this into the book? And I asked Luke, would it be okay to talk to him? And really things started to kind of build from there. So I was starting from this position of psychosis, wanting to understand more of that. And I knew that really there are all these different contexts in which there might be something to learn about presence, including things like epilepsy, including Parkinson's. It's actually a very common phenomenon in Parkinson's. Survival situations I've already mentioned. Things like bereavement, grief and bereavement. It's very common that people feel a continuing presence of somebody they've lost. And then perhaps some of the most common examples of presence are those that occur in sleep paralysis, where people wake up, they've got REM muscle atonia, so their muscles are paralyzed, but they're still kind of cognitively awake. And then they're very, very likely to experience hallucinations in general, but felt presences in particular, and perhaps are the most evil kinds of presence. Presences in sleep paralysis are particularly malevolent. So I wanted to... Oh,
Ben, can I just stop you? Sorry, we're still on the slide that says the problem. We can hear you perfectly well, but I don't know if we're still on that slide for you.
Oh, so sorry. That's strange. Shall I? So you've missed. Okay. So perhaps. I think Teams is playing. Let's restart the share. Sorry about that. Okay.
But the narrative was so compelling that we didn't realize for a long time that the slide should have been advancing anyway. So.
All you saw was some, or you missed rather, was some pictures of Luke Robertson, the explorer, looking suitably heroic. Right. Open share tray. Let's do this. I think PowerPoint had actually managed to freeze there for some reason, although it was still cycling for me.
Are you able to restart it?
I am restarting it now. I've switched off the. I had another screen on, which I think Teams for some reason thought was completely unacceptable. So. Okay.
Are you able to? Yeah.
Okay, you got PowerPoint again?
Yep.
Lovely. Can you see a slide that says why a book?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So you've already heard the narrative here. Not a book in 2016. Decided to write a book in 2020. Because I had a chance to talk to Luke Robertson, as you can see here on his skis. Now, as I was mentioning, this is something that there's actually many different ways you can try and understand presence in the round. And I actually decided, well, a book is the perfect way to explore this via people's stories. At the same time, it poses a challenge because a book is a linear object, right? People expect to start in one place and end in another place. And you as a writer have to create this narrative through it. And actually, when you're trying to draw upon all these different places as sources of kind of understanding for presence, that poses a challenge in itself. And realistically, there was many different things happening at the same time, almost simultaneously, in trying to understand the experience. But that's really more of a point about how you go about writing in this particular instance. Actually, I would say you end up working in quite a different way to what you might expect as researchers, which feels a lot more kind of straightforward sometimes. So understanding these experiences of presence in different ways, fundamentally through kind of dialogue and interview. That was something I wanted to do with the book, starting with, for example, an interview with Luke. But what I wanted to do is take Luke's example and try to use it as a means of trying to understand more about Shackleton and his perhaps most famous presence. For those of you who don't know this story, I'll try to sum it up fairly quickly. And just to double check, can everybody see missing piece 1 Shackleton on the screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Wonderful. So, as I said, the Endurance expedition, it started in 1914, it ended in 1916. It was led by Ernest Shackleton, the man you can see on the left here. And the idea was to try and reach the South Pole from the Weddell Sea, which is kind of roughly from the direction of Chile, which hadn't been attempted before. Amundsen had already reached the pole, but nobody else had attempted this kind of more ambitious crossing. And they never actually reached the landmass of Antarctica. And the Endurance was stuck in the ice fairly early on in the expedition, and before long it became crushed in the ice. The whole crew had to disembark onto the ice and live on the ice for about 9 months before trying to make their way essentially back to safety on the lifeboats that originally would have been on the Endurance. They had 3 of them, all were open boats essentially, they weren't suitable for kind of huge ocean crossings, and yet the crew were forced to do this. So 6 men, Shackleton, along with Tom Crean and Frank Worsley, who you can see here, and 3 others, they got on an open boat and managed to traverse 900 nautical miles to try and make their way to South Georgia Island, where there was a whaling station at Stromness. Once they got to South Georgia Island, they actually ended up on the wrong side of the island to where they wanted to be. 3 of them stayed where they'd landed, and Shackleton, Crean and Worsley were the last 3 of the expedition who had to then make their way across the island on foot, across the mountainous interior that you can see here, to try and reach safety and save the rest of the crew, who are either on South Georgia Island or on Elephant Island, which is just off the kind of the landmass of Antarctica, and basically didn't have enough food for them to live more than a few months there. And famously, these 3 men, in trekking across the island on a 36-hour trek, they managed it. Nobody knows how, and nobody knows of anybody who managed that before. It was an amazing feat of adventuring, really. But these 3 men all recounted this feeling that they had a 4th presence with them on this trek when it occurred. So Frank Worsley, in his account of the story, referred to them finding themselves counting their party. Shackleton, who was the other? Of course, there was only 3, but it's strange that mentally reviewing the crossing, they should always think of a 4th and then correct themselves. T.S. Eliot, and remembering this story then, 1922 in the Wasteland, referenced it by referring to a 3rd man. Who is the 3rd who walks always beside you? And that 3rd man then became the name for this experience, recurring again and again and again in situations of survival and adversity, and very often in kind of snowy conditions, either up Everest or in the Arctic or Antarctic. Now, all of the Endurance was saved because of the feats of these 3 men, and it's become a really famous example of a kind of hallucinatory experience. And yet, if you go back to their accounts, both from Shackleton's account south or Worsley's story as well, they're actually very meager in how they go about describing these experiences. And Shackleton indeed referred to it at one point as there are things which never can be spoken of, the sense that it kind of goes beyond the language that we'd usually use and touch some other kind of realm beyond their understanding. So from trying to think about, well, what's actually happening there, how can we understand that from what we know about unusual experiences and hallucinations, it's challenging from a psychologist's perspective. One thing I did before talking to Luke was actually go back to South itself and look through the whole account. And I really recommend people doing this, because actually when you read it, you realise that Shackleton was an excellent psychologist and a budding hallucinations researcher, really. And he was brilliant at writing about this environment and how much it created this sense of the unusual and the unreal months and months before anything happened on South Georgia Island. So in one of his best examples of that, Shackleton talks about people at home just not understanding the effects of the environment on their minds. He said, "This may seem fanciful to the reader, but the impression was real to us at the time. People living under civilized conditions may scarcely realize how quickly the mind, influenced by the eyes, responds to the unusual and weaves about its curious imaginings." And it's really replete through his account, examples of pareidolia, of at one point he refers to an iceberg kind of looming above them like an icy Cerberus that was kind of crying water out of its eyes. You know, he's kind of painting this landscape as he goes. And indeed, he was, you know, he was had aspirations to be a poet himself. But this was really an environment that was particularly conducive to creating these experiences. And yet, when it comes to the crunch of the thing that was particularly unusual, Shackleton almost clammed up. He couldn't talk about it in the same way. So I wanted to know more, and that was something that I could do, for example, by talking to Luke. Luke actually ended up doing a very similar, well, attempting a very similar journey, but he was somewhat more successful. So if you can see the map of Antarctica here, and you can see the orange line, that was the route that Luke took to get to the South Pole in 2015, landing at Hercules Inlet and then skiing solo and unsupported over 40 days to get to the South Pole. Just above Hercules Inlet in that kind of darker blue area, that's the Weddell Sea and the Ron ice shelf, and that's where Shackleton and his crew got stuck and never actually reached Antarctica itself. Now, talking to Luke was particularly interesting because what he described through the course of his 40-day trek was something that went from what might be classically considered kind of simple or like minor forms of hallucination, things that even he would call kind of, you know, tricks of the mind away, tricks of the eye. So at one point he looks up from his skis and sees the kind of green grass of home. Another point he thought he would start to get the Flintstones theme tune in his head, and then he'd think he'd see one of them on the horizon. And he was ready for all those sorts of experiences because he knew that these conditions could create that. And yet things started to go really kind of odd when he ran out of batteries to play music on his iPhone. And so instead he had silence, plus the wind that was coursing through Antarctica at the time. And what he started to get was a voice that every now and again would shout Luke, shout his name from behind him. And he knew that nobody could possibly be there, let alone anybody who knew his name. And he knew it was just a trick of the mind. And yet it distinctly felt like somebody was there. And he felt like he had to look over his shoulder each time somebody called, for fear that if this presence reached him, called up to him, it would tap him on his shoulder and his heart would stop. And if you explore the book a bit, Luke's actually had a history of problems with his heart, including being fitted with a pacemaker at an early age. And Luke is, you know, he was a young man to have this sort of surgery to his heart. But this was clearly a kind of a point of weakness for him. And this feeling of this other that was kind of behind him was really connected with that, with a sense of kind of isolation and safety. But that wasn't the only experience he had. He also, further on in his trek, at one point when he was struggling and really exhausted, getting close to the pole, but essentially running out of supplies and not really sleeping very much, a voice called to him to kind of get up and wake up. And had he not done that, had that not happened, he might have fallen asleep. And if he'd fallen asleep, it's highly likely he would have died. So it wouldn't take very long for him to get into serious difficulty there. And he heard that voice again at another point further down the line. And I talked to him about how those voices compared to his other experiences and the sense of him feeling the need to kind of look back. And he said with those two things being there, he felt like he was actually joined by a figure kind of ahead of him and a figure behind him at all points. One was there to look after him, and one was essentially almost kind of pursuing him or chasing him. Now, the reason that that's interesting is that the kind of the legend of the third man, of Shackleton's experiences, has created this idea that these experiences are essentially a defense mechanism. They're about what we need because we can't look after ourselves in these adverse situations. We need this figure of another to kind of pull us over the line. And Luke's kind of second voice or second entity was very much of that kind. But this other thing that was kind of essentially chasing him and sounded pretty terrifying, that rarely gets talked about when people talk about third man experiences. Indeed, it hints at a kind of survivor bias, right? Because there's lots of instances of these things kind of coming in the nick of time when people are up mountains or about to kind of die of frostbite. But we don't hear of many hallucinatory experiences of people being completely startled and so they fall off the ice shelf, or they're kind of really unsettled. And often, you know, these experiences are unsettling. They're really unreal. They're things that people have never come across before. So Luke's story, in contrast to Shackleton, highlights that actually, you know, when you experience the unreal, even if we're thinking about these kind of social and characterful aspects, things that might help us, you don't get to choose what's going to happen. And actually, there's many things out of your control. There's things that you're going to feel ambivalent about and have complicated feelings about as well. You know, if they are kind of in essence like hallucinatory people, then we can end up having the same sort of emotions and ties and responsibilities or feelings about them as other people do. And that's really just to highlight the kind of complexity of how these sorts of experiences can come across to people. And that prompted me to go back to some of Shackleton's accounts and indeed some other interviews he did with some journalists at the time, where he talks more extensively about the complex feelings he had about the other men on his expedition and the other people he was leaving behind as well. So I won't go into more detail with that story, but suffice to say, I think we can look past the legend of the third man and highlight something a bit more complex going on there for Shackleton as well, using Luke as a counterpoint. So another missing piece of this jigsaw for me in trying to understand presence was understanding a bit more about Parkinson's disease. And this isn't something that I tend to specialize in. It's something that I had to learn about for the book, and I was assisted by some very patient work from a former colleague, Jennifer Foley, who is a clinical neuropsychologist up at Queen's Square, working in UCL, specializing in the cognition in Parkinson's and dementia with Lewy bodies. And felt presence is actually a really common experience in Parkinson's. Traditionally, it's been considered part of minor hallucinations and often grouped with passage hallucinations, where people catch visual experiences out of the corner of their eyes. The interesting thing about Parkinson's presences is they're often very neutral. Like, even though they're kind of these hallucinatory phenomena, there's no sense of a strong identity. There's no sense of them necessarily, or there often isn't much of a sense of them having a strong kind of tie to the person. It's as if you have a wireframe or a mannequin or something, almost the way to describe it. Frank Ormsby, who's a Northern Irish poet who developed Parkinson's in his 60s, has written about a number of his hallucinatory experiences, including presence. So this poem, Side Effects 1, he writes about his experience of some visions, but also presences. That sense of, you know, maybe a kind of rough identity, like a girl at my shoulder, or somebody kind of directly behind you out of the corner of your eye. That's a very kind of common phenomenon, seemingly in Parkinson's. And there's a hint that actually, while in itself it's neutral, it might be an indicator of later difficulties, say cognitively, for people who are developing these experiences. Alongside that, there's emerging work now on something called phantom border syndrome, which is also occurs in Parkinson's. And that's a sense of presence which is particular to specific contexts and situations, such as upstairs at home or in the bedroom, where people have a feeling of presence almost tied to the kind of representation of home as well, which I've come across a little bit in psychosis too before. So Parkinson's is a useful example here, because what it does is actually elucidate some things about how this can be a kind of hallucinatory phenomenon away from feelings of, say, paranoia or more extensive delusions. There are almost kind of quite pure forms of presence which occur in Parkinson's in the way people describe them, and they tend to hang together with other forms of hallucinatory behavior, encouraging the suggestion that this is a kind of class of hallucination in some way, even if it's not clear the kind of almost like the sensory content of that hallucination. And finally, a missing piece for me in writing this story actually came from people with lived experience of psychosis themselves. Clearly, my own interest in this area started through talking with voice hearers who'd had these experiences, but at the same time, people were working on this from a grassroots perspective as well. And Nev Jones and Shannon Pagden in 2021, as I was writing the book, published their first report for an initiative called Psychosis Outside the Box, where they collected together a series of accounts of the ways in which people experienced phenomena that weren't captured by the usual descriptions of psychosis. And in particular, they zoomed in on visions, visual changes, felt presences, and alterations of space and time. Now, this was framed as a non-research project. They saw it as an initiative just to bring together experiences and provide kind of strategies and solutions for people with psychosis. But they were highlighting it because they feel like this is something that we're missing in whether we're doing research or we're doing kind of clinical work with psychosis, that presence is underlying a lot of these phenomena. And that really, at the time as I was writing, thought, well, actually, this is an important thing that we do need to understand a bit more. So in the last part of my talk, and thank you for your patience, apologies for the some of the technical difficulties there, I just want to give you a flavour of some of the kind of scientific work that's been going on to give us more of an understanding of felt presence. Some of this is in the book, some of it is new stuff. Now, I put new in brackets because actually there's a wealth of data out there around from neuropsychology and from neurology that allows us to kind of get a grip on actually how this phenomena happens with a very scientific basis. And the starting point is work by people like Shaharazu and Olaf Blanker, and some of you may have heard of these examples already. So in 2006, Arzi and colleagues showed that if you electrically stimulate left temporoparietal junction, you can produce the sense of an illusory shadow person that seems to map your body position in some way. More recently, Blanker and colleagues over the past 10 years or so have advanced some of those ideas and findings to put forward quite detailed now sensory motor model of how an experience of presence could occur. And they do that via something I call the presence robot, which essentially uses the logic of full body illusions, where you create kind of synchronous expectations of motor feedback using a button press system. You press out into the air and you get pressed on your back, and then you disrupt those cues, those synchronous cues, to get asynchronicities, disruptions to expectations. When you do that very consistently, people start to get a feeling that there is a presence immediately behind them driving those positions. And the interesting thing about this this paradigm is that people with Parkinson's are particularly susceptible to it. They really do have strong feelings of presence when they have a go on the presence robot. And they've also tried to apply it to schizophrenia patients, but they found that it was more particularly for people who had experiences of passivity that they were likely to experience presences using this paradigm. So there are ways in which we can almost try to produce the sense of presence and then try and understand it with a sensory motor model. In our own work through Hearing the Voice, we ran a series of surveys trying to compare some of the different contexts and phenomena and accounts of presence across different kinds of populations. And this work came out in PsychMed last year. We did 3 online surveys comparing a kind of general call, which actually ended up recruiting quite a lot of voice hearers and people with psychiatric diagnoses, a sample of people from spiritualists and New Age networks who describe feelings of presence, and a sports and kind of solo pursuits group. We assessed them on different measures of things like paranoia, hallucination proneness, sleep quality. And we also coded some of the experiences using a kind of interdisciplinary team, a phenomenological coding system. And through that, we're allowed to come up with some very kind of common and core elements of the experience, such as a feeling or a knowing of a sense of form or identity, but also things that distinguish these different groups. So, for example, the kind of general call, which ended up kind of being a slightly more kind of clinically enriched sample, their presences there were also associated with auditory experiences, feelings of fear and dread, and stress and illness, whereas some of the sports experiences were more associated with things of being watched, often being outside and often recurring in specific contexts. We also found across these 3 samples that feelings of presence tended to hang together more particularly with general hallucination proneness, rather than experiences of, say, paranoia, and rather than other unusual experiences like accounts of dissociation. There's also a hint as well that for more kind of problematic presences, there was a slight gender bias that women were more likely to report difficult presences than men. We've since followed up some of that work with further analysis on our patient cohort from the paper I mentioned in 2021, and a second cohort too. In that patient cohort, what we found is that people who reported presences tended to score more on the CIRATs for general hallucination scores, well, auditory hallucination scores, rather than for delusion scores. They're also more particularly likely to score highly on the emotional elements of the CIRATs, rather than things to do with, say, physical position or kind of cognitive control elements. And in that sample, we find that people who report presence are more likely to also report tactile hallucinations, feelings of fear, and voices that kind of very directly address them. We also found, again, a bit of a gender imbalance with being more common in female patients. In the second patient sample that I mentioned, this was a cohort as part of a trial led by Rob Dudley up in the northeast. We found some quite high rates of felt presence, up to 2/3 of people reported things like presence in that sample, although we need to tread carefully with some of those phenomena because they seemed a bit overlap quite a lot with feelings of paranoia in this instance. We also looked at things like whether people had individual presences or had these kind of multimodal sensory experiences that also felt like they had presence, and some people had just one and some people had more of that kind of multimodal example. And most recently as well, I've been doing some work with Iris Sommer's group in Groningen, and in particular Zana Brederu, postdoc and ClinPsych there. And we found from some of their population or kind of large sample data looking at proneness in the general healthy population in Holland that actually felt presence seemed to be more common in women and men in that sample too, also associated with things like sleep quality and loneliness as well. And that's under review at the moment, but should be coming out very soon. Finally, some of you may have seen this already, but we published the first transdiagnostic review of these experiences in Lancet Psychiatry in April this year, in a review led by Joan Barmby and Royal Holloway. And that was, as far as we know, one of the first times that people have tried to bring together all these different contexts to try and understand what's happening for presence and what in turn that might mean for, say, things like clinical management and understanding of psychosis. So a bit of a whistle stop to at the end there for some of the science relating to presence, and an idea of how we can use different stories and interviews to try and understand, say, some of the more historical examples of presence. But really, I'd be interested to know your questions or reflections on this phenomenon. I'm sure there's a lot of expertise in the room and online as well. And this is really something that we're only just beginning, I think, to understand what might actually be happening. And I'll stop there and say thank you to my collaborators, both at Durham and elsewhere, and for people who supported the development of the book, including, for example, my agent, Kirsty McLaughlin, my editors, Michael Flamini and Kim Walker. And hopefully, Tom, you can still hear me and see me.
Can. Thank you so much, Ben. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I did find it quite scary. I'm all right. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or put the questions in the chat. I'm going to take the chair's privilege if I can and just ask a question. It came up on 2 of your slides, and it's something I've been fascinated by. I don't think I understand that much about it, but is the question of tulpomancy. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about it. And also, people seem to reject it as sort of a little bit outlandish and weird. And it's always struck me that, well, actually, we see people in our dreams the whole time, and they're sort of well-constructed presences. So why do people think that tulpomancy is so strange if they're sort of constructing presences in waking life?
Yeah. So tulpomancy, for anybody who hasn't come across it, is a practice used primarily by people on, say, kind of Reddit forums and internet kind of groups, where they try and create what they would term a sentient being via their own mind, via the kind of process of the imagination. As if you're creating an imaginary friend that can talk back to you. It draws on techniques which are often attributed to Tibetan Buddhism, but we've come across them via people working on things like theosophy in the early 20th century. So they've kind of been through a bit of a filter, almost a kind of bit of a like Western and New Age filter before they come to us as the practice of tulpomancy. But the tulpa is the thing you're trying to create, this other that can talk back to you. And the interesting thing about tulpomancers is, one, they describe ultimately these phenomena, these entities that seem to be able to talk of their own accord and feel like they have their own presence in some way. But secondly, the techniques that tulpomancers describe are to some degree similar to things like mindfulness and meditation, and similar to fiction writers in how they talk about creating kind of vivid characters. Not all fiction writers, but some, and we did some work on that as part of Hearing the Voice as well. So there are, I would say, tulpomancers, I haven't done direct research with them, but knowing people who have, I would say they're an interesting group of people. They're not who you think they are. I think often they get stereotyped, really. And they're doing something quite creative and unusual. Now, whether people want to say, yes, that is creating a presence, or whether you want to go there or not. Something like the process is really interesting for kind of the states that you can put yourself in terms of agency and dissociation, when people are doing very, very in-depth, work on absorption and mind wandering and meditation and controlled attention. So that's why, I talk about them late on in the book, really to think, is this something that we need to bring into the fold and understand as a form of presence, because they don't feel like they have bodies. They feel like quite different from, say, some of the Parkinson's presences, but tulpomancers talk about their tulpas having presence, and so you do need to kind of at least have the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's just another one of these areas where things that are sort of considered by psychiatrists as pathological, one suddenly finds a sort of whole subculture where it's presumably not pathological and positively the opposite, possibly. Great. Okay, so we have some hands raised. First question was from Nick Medford. Nick, can you turn your camera
on? Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much for the interesting talk. I just really wondered about any ideas about the neuroscience of this. It looked on the last slide as though there was some kind of tentative neuroanatomical model, and I just wondered if you could. I appreciate that you're talking about a whole range of different contexts, so there probably isn't a one-size-fits-all model, but I just wondered if you could talk us through anything that there is.
Absolutely. So we are in the exciting new lands of people declaring that there's a presence network. Blanca's team at Geneva have identified a network which they say is distinct to presence experiences versus other kinds of hallucination. I think it's useful to start more with the kind of neurology and neuropsychology cases. So a really striking finding is that I mentioned you can stimulate left TPJ and produce something like these experiences. Both stimulation and basically kind of individual difference correlations in fMRI seem to associate out-of-body experiences more with right TPJ. So that sort of contrast, there's some sort of suggestion there that the kind of the integrative role of something to do with body representation bilaterally in TPJ is also playing out differently for kind of, in a way, external body position versus one's own, perhaps a body map kind of transposed. And that's certainly the interpretation of the left TPJ work, is that it's disrupting some sort of integrated body map and its position in the world. The presence network itself has been attributed more to areas like middle frontal gyrus, to some degree inferior frontal gyri, and parts of superior temporal gyri as well. But I think there is debate in the wider research community who work on this thing as to whether we're really picking out something specific to presence experiences, or indeed whether we're picking out, to some degree, those hubs come up in networks in, say, Phil Maguire's work from the early 2000s on auditory hallucinations in the brain. Like there's a lot going on in terms of both frontal parietal communication, but also frontal temporal synchrony that underpins a lot of self-monitoring experiences in relation to self-monitoring processes in relation to hallucinations. So we're getting there. There are hints towards it. I would say presences are much more associated with parietal cortical kind of change, damage, and activity than other forms of hallucination, but we're not quite there yet as having, I'd say, a kind of accepted model.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from George Severs. It says, one patient group who often seem to have hallucinatory experiences outside of clinical psychosis are those with autism spectrum disorder. Do you know if there's been any work on ASD and passage or presence phenomena? I
don't know of any, but there's very little phenomenological work on the experience of any hallucinations in the context of autism. To my knowledge, it's something that I'm starting to try and work on separately from this work. But it's another kind of blind spot in how we, in a way, understand the more kind of complex level of these experiences. And as some of you will know as well, there's kind of historical distinctions between, say, autism and schizophrenia, and kind of trumping rules and diagnosis have meant that much of the literatures have bifurcated, and actually there probably is a time and indeed a clinical need now to understand more about psychotic phenomena in autism. So I hope if you ask me again in a few years' time, I'll be able to answer that, but it's not something that I know of actually that there's published work on.
Thank you. very intriguing question here from Matt Butler. Thanks for the amazing presentation. We'll definitely be buying the book. But thinking aloud, curious if there's any literature on anything like a felt absence, so a feeling that someone who should be there is missing.
I mean, the closest to that is literature on grief and bereavement, and probably, you know, there are as many people who will talk about felt absences as felt presences. There's some good work being done on that from a kind of phenomenology angle at University of York. Matthew Ratcliffe, for example, is working extensively on grief and has compared it almost to a kind of phantom limb experience, which speaks more to kind of, in a way, that sense of absence alongside presence. As I'm sure you can imagine, that's an area that's quite hard to work on because people can understandably be quite coy about their experiences and don't want to be misinterpreted or pathologized. It's a challenging one. One thing in my writing of the book and working with some collaborators that really stuck with me was that I think sometimes people assume in the context of grief or bereavement, these experiences are to do with longing and expectation, like, you know, you lose a life partner, but you still have a sense of them in their chair or something like that. But actually, there can easily happen as well for relationships that you don't want to continue, that actually you have very ambiguous and ambivalent feelings about, and yet there's a bond there, which means that the presence kind of continues, and they can be some of the most difficult experiences for people.
Thank you. Quinton Dealey has raised his hand. Quinton, can you switch your camera on? And
Hi,
Quinn.
The brilliant talk. Thanks so much. So I'm just wondering, actually, whether you think a picture is emerging of different, perhaps we can think of them as different dimensions of hallucinations. Traditionally, we perhaps tended to think of hallucinations as very perceptual terms, but actually listening to you, it seems that we can draw out different strands. There are these rather sort of fleeting, phenomenologically transient, rather thin perceptual changes. Then there's a sense of presence, which is really the vivid sense of the presence of an identity, of some kind of agent. But then actually, we get this this phenomenon, certainly clinically, but perhaps in the cases you're discussing as well, where you get very rich narratives elaborated over presences. So we certainly clinically see people that draw together all of these things. They're very vivid perceptual changes, a very strong sense of presence, and a very strong sense of narrative surrounding, versus these sort of thinner, more fleeting. So it seems to me that it's actually turning out to be quite a diverse space within which human beings pull together these strands in different ways. Can you comment on that? What do you think?
I mean, I think you're onto something there. What you're describing in the last instance, Quint, was kind of partly what I was expecting once we started doing work on psychosis. I think we thought that maybe the narrative would come before the presence. There's something about that wider sense of a very, very personified or characterized voice that could come in other modalities, ultimately would conjure up this enduring presence. And obviously, you know, if an entity has presence, even when it's not, you know, speaking or even clearly with you, it means it can go off and do other things. It can have a fuller biography in a way. But from what we've seen so far, it comes back to some more basic feelings of presence that people can have in the absence of other things. It's not so much tied to that kind of that richer personified story as we would have expected. And I think but that's not the same as saying it pulls right back to the kind of those fleeting examples, because the fleeting examples you mentioned at the start are actually quite similar to Parkinson's. So the thing I didn't say about Parkinson's is they don't persist that long. You just kind of get them for an instant and then off they go again, like a switch that's flipped on. So it might be the psychosis presences are somewhere between the two, actually, that you can have it as a very basic and primitive feeling. And yet it might be something kind of quite enduring for people who are finding it difficult, as opposed to in Parkinson's, it is much more like the flash out of the corner of your eye, you know, blink and you miss it, or feel it momentarily and off it goes. I mean, the more and more work you talk to somebody like Barry Smith, philosopher who works on the senses, he'll laugh at you if you say there are only 5 senses. And I think that things that talking about presence as being this kind of baffling phenomenon, if you understand sensory experience to be much broader than the 5 traditional senses, then it should be possible that we have hallucinatory or kind of what looks like hallucinatory phenomena across things like proprioception and kind of vague kind of body sense, across more synesthetic experiences and all these things too. So I think that's really what we're getting into, and then it's how far it goes, really.
Thank you.
Thank you. We still do have some questions in the chat, but I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up now. I'm sure if anyone has any questions, at least some of them will be answered in this book. Presents available in all good bookshops now. Yeah, I'm sure people will be welcome if they have a burning question to contact the speaker as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to Ben Alderson-Day for a really fascinating talk. I wish we could have had longer, but we're very, very grateful. Just like to say we do have another talk next Tuesday. Same time, we've got Professor Jesus Ramirez Bermudez from Mexico City, who another sort of big name in sort of cognitive neuropsychiatry and sort of phenomenology as well as the sort of more sort of neuroscience end of things, and he's going to be talking about sort of Mexican neuropsychiatric experience with a special focus on psychosis and some of the sort of organic differentials of psychotic illness. So looking forward to seeing you all then. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for joining online. Thank you very much to Ben Alderson-Day.
Thanks, Tom.